You think the Vikings were a world of free men and honor, a society built on strength, courage, and reputation. That story only works if you ignore the people who built everything, because beneath their ships and sagas lived humans who didn't count as human. They were alive, they breathed, they worked, and still they did not count. In the Viking world there was a word for people like this. Thralls, not prisoners, not servants, property. You think you know the Vikings, raiders, warriors, free men bound by honor. But that image only survives if you never look down. Because beneath every longhouse, every ship, every farm, there were people whose names were never meant to survive. Thralls were not born into the sagas. They were erased from them. Most were taken, not made. Captured in raids along the coasts of Britain and Ireland, from the Slavic lands, from the Baltic. Some were seized far inland, dragged from villages that never expected the sea to arrive armed. Others were born already owned, children of people who were already owned. Once taken, there was no ceremony, no declaration. One moment you were a person with kin. The next, you were counted with livestock. And this is where the story turns. Because Viking slavery was not chaotic, it was organized, normal, legal. Thralls were listed in law codes alongside oxen and tools. They were inherited, sold, traded, given as gifts. A man's wealth was not measured only in silver. It was measured in how many lives he controlled. Thralls built the farms that fed the free. They cleared forests, drained marshes, rowed ships across freezing water. They cooked meals they would never eat at the table. They raised children who would never call them family. And they slept where they were told, if they were allowed to sleep at all. You might imagine constant violence, chains, whips, screams. But that wasn't the most effective part. The most effective part was permanence. Thralls had no legal personhood. They could not testify in court. They could not swear oaths that mattered. If a thrall was killed, it was not murder. It was damage to property. Compensation was paid to the owner, not to the dead, not to their family, if they had one. At that point, survival stopped being the goal. Not being noticed became the goal. Some thralls were branded. Others were marked by shaved heads or forced clothing. But often, nothing visible was needed. Everyone already knew who mattered. What followed was quieter and worse. Thralls lived inside the same communities as free people. They saw festivals they could not join, heard songs about freedom and honor, watched assemblies where law was spoken aloud, knowing it did not apply to them. They were always present, and always invisible. Women thralls carried an additional burden. They worked the fields, they worked the households, and they were spoken of quietly, rarely written about, never centered in the stories. Children born from these encounters did not inherit status from the father. They inherited silence. Some of these children were freed. Most were not. Freedom itself was not a rescue. A freed thrall was still marked. Their past followed them like a shadow. They could not easily marry into free families. They could not forget where they came from. And the community made sure they remembered. But this still wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how disposable thralls became when belief demanded it. In the Viking world, death did not end obligation. It extended it. When a powerful man died, he did not go alone. He went with what he owned. Archaeology confirms what the sagas avoid explaining. Human remains beside high-status burials, bodies placed deliberately, not honored, positioned. Thralls were killed to serve in the afterlife, not because they were special, but because they were replaceable. They were tools, even in death. There are accounts of thralls being asked to volunteer. But choice under ownership is not choice. It is theater. The message was simple. Your life belonged to someone else. Your death did too. And still, the system endured. Because it was profitable. Viking raids were not only about gold, they were about people. The slave trade connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world, to Byzantium, to Eastern Europe. Human beings became currency. Young, strong, adaptable. A single thrall could be traded again and again. Their language lost, their name replaced, their past erased so thoroughly that even they began to forget it. And that was the point. To survive, thralls learned silence. They learned to watch without reacting, to obey without being seen as obedient, to exist in a narrow space where punishment did not notice them. Some ran. Few succeeded. The land was not neutral. Distance, isolation, winter. Escape did not mean freedom. It meant becoming something worse than owned. It meant becoming hunted. And here is the part most stories avoid. The Viking world could not function without thralls. Not at its scale. Not with its ambitions. Every expedition relied on labor at home. Every feast relied on unseen hands. Every warrior's freedom was purchased by someone else's captivity. The myth of universal Viking freedom collapses here, because freedom, in that world, was selective. It was guarded, and it was built on exclusion. Over time, Christianity changed the language around slavery. Not immediately, not cleanly. Thralls were baptized, but baptism did not free them. Laws shifted slowly. Manumission became more common. But the damage was already done. Generations had lived and died unnamed. When the Viking Age ended, the thralls did not rise into history. They dissolved into it. Their descendants blended in. Their suffering absorbed, their stories unrecorded. The sagas remember kings, explorers, poets. They do not remember the woman who hauled water every morning until her hands failed, or the man who rode until his body could not be sold again, but they were there, everywhere. And this is the uncomfortable truth. The Vikings were not unique in this, but they were honest about it. They did not pretend everyone was equal. They built a world where inequality was normal, legal, and sacred. Thralls were alive without being counted, present without being seen, essential without being acknowledged. A society that decides who counts always survives. The question is, at whose expense?